everyone to the very special collaboration between the Social Science Speaker Series and the Letters and Arts Society here at Fanshawe College. This is the 40th anniversary of the Letters and Arts Society, and I'm Ingrid Hutchinson and currently in charge of the Letters and Arts Society, and we invite literary guests, writers in the Canadian world of publishing into the college so that they can meet you and address you. And we also have a very special guest today that we are sharing with the Social Science Speaker Series. And we're very glad that you're here. And I'm now going to introduce Kevin Muir. He is the manager of the First Nations Centre, and he's going to introduce our guest.
Bonjour, hello. Very honored to be here today to welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. James Bartleman. He's a member of the Chippewa of Rama First Nation. He received his early education in Port Carling and London. He attended the University of Western Ontario and was a teacher for 3 years in the early 1960s. He then joined the Department of External Affairs and served for 35 years inter alia as ambassador to Cuba, Israel, NATO, and the European Union, High Commissioner to South Africa and Australia, and Assistant Secretary to the Federal Cabinet for Foreign and Defense Policy. From 2002 to 2007, he was Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. During his term in office, he championed 3 social justice causes: mental illness stigma, anti-racism, and the well-being of Native children. Remembering the importance of books and literacy in helping him emerge from a background of poverty, he established libraries in First Nations communities across Ontario, established summer reading camps in all the fly-in First Nations in the province, set up Club Epidemic, a book club providing free books to children aged 5 to 12 in the fly-in communities, as well as numerous other initiatives to provide sport and music equipment to disadvantaged Native youth. He holds 13 honorary doctorates, as well as the following awards: Officer of the Order of Canada, Order of Ontario, Knight of Justice, Order of St. John, National Aboriginal Achievement Award, Phi Delta Kappa Educator of the Year Award, Canadian Institute of Child Health National Child Care Award, the Arthur Kroger College Award in Ethics and Public Affairs, Mood Disorders Association Hero Award, Center for Addiction and Mental Health Courage to Come Back Award, Dr. Hugh Lafavre Award, the Dare Arts Cultural Award, the Marion DeWar Defender of the Public Good Award. He is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, and since his retirement as Lieutenant Governor, he has written a novel on the intergenerational impact of the residential school experience on the current epidemic of youth suicide in Northern Ontario. As Long as the Rivers Flow. He is married to Marie-Jeanne and has 3 children, Anne Pascal, Laurent, and Elaine, as well as 3 grandchildren, Sebastian, Nicholas, and Henry. So I'd like to take this time now to please have a warm round of applause for our guest speaker, Mr. James Bartleman. Thank you.
Did my grade 13 in London, back in the days when they had grade 13s, and did 4 years at Western, and managed to graduate and go on and really have do a lot of interesting things in my life. But when I was Lieutenant Governor, I was really interested in 3 social justice causes. I didn't want to be a Lieutenant Governor that would just ride around in a horse and buggy and initiate people into various orders and hand out prizes for this and that. I wanted to use my office to promote some causes that have been very important to me ever since I was a child. And these were, as mentioned, the trying to being associated with the fight against the stigma associated with mental illness, because I had been myself and very depressed and was suicidal at one stage after I'd been beaten up and nearly died in botched hotel robbery when I was High Commissioner in South Africa many years ago. And I also wanted to speak out on discrimination, because I can remember what it was like when I was a kid growing up in an Aboriginal family in an all-white village, and particularly try to do something for Native youth in the north. And so I was given access to an Ontario government aircraft and told to go and visit communities across the province. And so I made use of that aircraft to visit the remote communities in the north of Ontario. In the north of Ontario, an area which is about the size of France and Belgium put together, is the homeland of the OJ Cree people, and many Ojibwe people as well. And it is an area where a huge part of that, there are no year-round roads, and you can only have access by air, or in the winter by winter road. And so it is an area which is not known in the province. And I made a visit to Saskatchewan early on in my term as Lieutenant Governor, and which leads me into saying, that is why I took a great deal of interest in Native children, and that is why I'm titling this talk, Ontario's Forgotten Native Children. As my aircraft flew into Saskatchewan, which is at the mouth of the Albany River, which is Ontario's longest river, flowing into James Bay, there was a great crowd of people I could see on the ground, and an aircraft was just departing. And when my plane landed, I asked the chief what was going on, and he said that a 13-year-old girl had killed herself. And I said, why? And he looked at me as if I was, really naive, and he said, because she had no hope. Not too long afterwards, the Grand Chief Stan Beardy of the Anishinaabe Nation, which is the political organization for 49 First Nations in that area, called me to say that 3 kids had killed themselves at Winneman Lake First Nation, which is a community in the interior, an OJ Cree community. When I say OJ Cree, the language is a mixture of Cree and Ojibwe. And he said the community was shut down, everybody was in a state of mourning and shock. And he wanted me to come up and to show the people of the community that the rest of the province cared. So I flew up. I picked the Grand Chief up in Thunder Bay. We went into Winneman Lake. And indeed, the community was in a state of great shock. They were just kids, grade 7 and 8. One of them had hanged herself in a tree as the other kids came to school in the morning. And I was told that they had been part of a suicide pact, and that when the first child died, the spirit of that child went to visit the other 2 at night and said, now you have to do it. You promised. No one has ever kept their promises to us kids here. Now you promised to die, and you've got to die. And the second one then died. And those 2 went to see the third, and the third died. And I discovered that in fact this was quite common, that when there were suicide pacts, the dead would come in to the others and urge them to die. And so people were always very concerned when they discovered that one of their children had been visited by the spirit of the dead. I went to the school, and the kids in the grade 7 and 8 class, those that were left, they were wearing hoodies, and they wouldn't look up. They looked only at their desk. And they looked like they were in a state of terminal depression. And I was sure that it wouldn't be long before some of those other kids would be taking their lives as well. And I asked the same question, why? And the answer was, because they had no hope. And then I visited Bartleman First Nation, which is not a flying community. It used to be called the Osmonds First Nation near Pickle Lake. And I, as my OPP drivers took me into the community, what was pretty marking, which was really astounding, were the number of graveyards and the number of fresh mounds. And on the mounds were crosses, and on the crosses were baseball hats, dolls, fishing line, all the things that children played with. And the chief told me that in the previous 10 years, they had something like 200 deaths in the community from violence. Not just kids, but a lot of kids who were killing themselves, but people who hated themselves, who were murdering each other, who were fighting, who were getting drunk, deliberately going out and lying down on the highway so that the tractor trailers could ride over them. And I asked the same question, why are the children doing it? And he said as well that they had no hope. And then I discovered that there had been a suicide epidemic among Native kids going on throughout the NAN territory. And it started in 1987, about 10 years after the closure of the last residential school in Ontario, and more or less at the same time as the opening up of the remote communities by the Winter Road, where the kids could come out, people could come out and discover that they weren't wanted. And so I was quite heartbroken about this whole thing, because this was going on year after year. It would flare up in one community, die off, and another community would pick it up. We kept began to come. They've had, what, 12 or 13 in the last couple of years. People have killed themselves. And so I asked myself two questions. Why did the children have no hope? Why are they killing themselves? And secondly, why does mainstream society not care? And my background before I became a diplomat was in history. So I looked to history for the causes. And let's just take a look at the history of Native settler, Native European relations. Starting in the arrival of the Europeans in North America, in what would become Canada, was at the beginning of the 17th century, around 1600. And for the next 200 years, the Native people and the European arrivals lived in a type of symbiotic relationship. The Europeans needed the Native people to adjust to the land, to a harsh climate, and be introduced to the foods and various things like that. They also, because this was one of the first reasons they came here, was they needed the furs that the Native people had in order to promote the fur trade, make their livings. And then very important for the French arrivals was the need to save souls. And that's why in this part of Ontario, there were the European arrivals here in the first 40, 50 years of the 17th century were led by the Catholic Church, the Jesuits. You've probably all heard of the Jesuit relations, where they sent back their reports on living with the Hurons, living with the Neutrals, the Tobacco Nation people, all in this area. And farther north, the land of the Anishinaabe hunter-gatherer peoples. And so they also needed the Native people to provide warriors in their fights against other Europeans. First of all, it was the Hurons, the French, against the Iroquois and the Dutch and then the English, and later on between the British and the French, and then between the Americans and the British. Native warriors were key partners, key drivers of those wars, colonial wars between Hello? 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 Hello?
Test.
And so the first 200 years passed pretty well between the natives and the non-native people. But then the relationship shifted, and it shifted at the time of the War of 1812. In that war, that was the last time that native people were really essential in what became Canada for their survival of what would become Canada. Because when that war started, it looked like it would just be a walk in the park for the Americans. They had 75,000 men in their militia. The British had very few. Americans had 5,000 regular soldiers. The British had fewer than 1,000. But what the British had on their side were the native people. And in that first year of the war, which we are now commemorating the 200th anniversary, the native warriors saved Canada. Because in the north, they are the ones who really seized Fort Michilimackinac and closed off the northern area of the colony from American invasion. They're the ones who are responsible for the capture of Fort Detroit, which then closed off the western approaches to the province. They're the ones who, under the Joseph Brant and Chief Norton from the Mohawks of the Thames, they're the ones who rallied the British troops after the death of General Brock and chased the Americans off the Queenston Heights and saved Canada. The next year, things changed. The British sent in more and more troops. The native soldiers were not, the warriors were not as essential, and they were betrayed. They were betrayed at the Battle of York, which became Toronto. The British fled when the Americans attacked and left the native warriors to fight and be killed. Here, there was a great battle, called it the Battle of the Thames, in which Tecumseh and the Shawnee warriors and the Anishinaabe and Mohawk warriors were left in the lurch as the British troops fled, and Tecumseh was killed. And after that, the war ended, and native warriors were no longer needed. Native people became an obstacle to settlement. And so the first approach of the British and then the nascent Canadian, evolving Canadian political entity was to take the land of the natives and to make room for settlement. And they did this through a process of signing treaties with them. And this treaty-making process went on until in what was Upper Canada, up until the early 20th century. But what happened was they said two things, or they did two things. They gathered together the people and they said that to sign this document and you will have a right to hunting and fishing in your traditional lands as long as the sun rises and the waters flow. But when the people who were illiterate signed, they were signing a document which said you will have a right to your traditional lands until the white people want them. And that is what happened. So the native people were pushed off into very small pieces of land. Their lands were taken over, and that has been the basis of a great deal of animosity and bitterness among native people ever since. But the Europeans didn't want to stop there. They wanted to They wanted to eliminate native people and reserves altogether through a process of assimilation. And that is when they came up with the concept of residential schools, something which they picked up from the United States, where the Americans, after defeating native tribes in battles, would take their children and put them in a type of reform school, shave their heads, and treat them under sort of prison regimes to try and turn them into Americans. So we had a different approach in Canada, with the same principle: assimilate the native people. And so the idea was to send them off to special residential schools. The government enlisted the support of the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Anglican Church, and contracted out the work to them. And but there was no accountability. So the teachers, and the priests, and the nuns, and the ministers could do anything they wanted. They were not. No one really cared, because they were, after all, just Indians as far as they were concerned. So 150,000 children went through the residential school system across Canada for over 100 years, and each time the children went to a school, they came back diminished. First group would go, they were forbidden to speak their language. They were told that their culture was of no value. They were beaten in many cases, fed slop, raped. Many died, tens of thousands died, and nobody cared really what happened to them. And so that led to huge problems down through the generations. Now, just to give you a sense of the attitude of the people running the residential schools, here is a poem by Duncan Campbell Scott. Duncan Campbell Scott was a poet of the Confederation who was renowned in Canada for having such a very artistic, poetic, humanitarian spirit. Someone who played Mozart very well. And he was a writer, and he wrote about, and he was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs. He's the one who was responsible for making the residential school system function for the federal government. He was in place for 50 years. He's the one who passed regulations, or had the government pass regulations, to empower the police to seize native children from their parents and take them by force to residential schools. He's the one who brought in regulations to forbid native people from practicing their culture, to end powwows, to end anything associated with their culture. His philosophy was, you kill the native in the child, and then they'll all be good Europeans like us. But here is a poem, one of the poems he wrote, called the Onondaga Mandana. She stands full-throated and with careless pose, a woman of a weird and waning race, the tragic savage lurking in her face, where all her pagan passion burns and glows. Her blood is mingled with her ancient foes, and thrills with war and wildness in her veins. Her rebel lips are dabbled with the stains of feuds and forays and her father's woes. And closer in the shawl about her breast, paler than she, her baby clings and lies, the latest promise of her nation's doom, the primal warrior gleaming from his eyes. He sulks and burdened with his infant gloom, he draws his heavy brows and will not rest. So the philosophy was that native people weren't really real people, like Europeans. That brings me to the issue of, why does society not care that native people continue to be the other in society? The other in society, and this is something which applies to anybody from a different culture or ethnicity from your own that you don't really understand. The other is someone from a different ethnicity, religion, or culture. But Native people were the other with the difference, because in the 19th century, it was sort of generally accepted wisdom that Native people, Aboriginal people around the world were primitive. And as a matter of fact, up until recently, anthropologists in their studies actually said anthropology was the study of primitive people. And settlers, when they came to Canada and the United States, were not really sure that Native people were fully human. I remember when I served, my first posting as a junior diplomat was in Colombia back in the late 60s. And I remember hearing stories about settlers hunting Indians on weekends, just for sport. And I went down with a film crew to record it. And there was a story done, but the Colombian government didn't care. They didn't consider that Native people were real people. I served in Australia as High Commissioner. And there I discovered that in Australia, the government had a practice for many years of taking any child born of a Aborigine mother and a white father from the mother shortly after birth, and the child would never see the mother again, and they would raise them in special schools to be to work for as maids and what all for white people, because they were not fully human in their view. And so it is something that's common around the world, that the first peoples, the Aboriginal people, historically were looked upon as being of a lower order of humanity. And that contributed to them being looked upon in purely stereotypical form. Ralph Ellison, who is a fantastic American author, black author, one of the first great writers who emerged after the war, which prepared the way for the Civil Rights Revolution in the United States in the 1960s, wrote a book called The Invisible Man. From the point of view of a black person in New York who walks through the city, but people don't see him. They just see a stereotype. They just see the other. They just see something which is subhuman. And in this book, I'll just read a bit from it. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. And I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me, like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows. It is as though I have been surrounded by a hard, distorting glass mirror. When people approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of biochemical accident to my epidermis. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those I come into contact with. A matter of construction of the inner eye upon reality. You wondered whether you weren't simply a phantom in other people's minds, say, a figure in a nightmare which the sleeper tries with all his might to destroy. That is really the problem, not just with white views of Native people, but views of individuals and whole groups, about other groups, about people when they look sometimes at Muslim Canadians, or in Europe, when they look at the arrival of Serbs or Croats into their area, they don't see them as people. They see them as stereotypes, and they're invisible. But as far as Native people are concerned, the consequences are really enormous in Canada. We have really quite good relations in Canada between members of Canada's multicultural community. People have come to Canada from 100 different countries, and compared to the way people integrate, people work for a common national cause and get along, we get along remarkably well, compared to the situation in France and in Belgium, and England, even in the United States. But Native people are outside that. They are still very much the other. And that is why people pay no attention when they look at the figures and they see that 600 women at least have disappeared, have been murdered, killed, ground up in some cases, and eaten by pigs, by sexual deviants in British Columbia, and nobody cares. That they have the lowest levels of literacy in the country, nobody cares. That the most poverty-stricken people, and nobody cares. That they have the lowest levels of educational attainment, and the government provides for their education only between 50 and 80% of the levels of money which they provide on a per capita basis to non-Native people off reserve. And nobody cares. This should be a national, there should be a national outcry about it. That is why the epidemics of tuberculosis and diabetes, and nobody cares. The Canadian Auditor General sent more than 24 reports to Parliament calling for action, but they have just been ignored. There's been no rising up of national protest over this unequal funding of education, or about the fact that all these children are dying up north. Nobody cares. I grew up in the Muskoka area back in the 1940s and early 50s. And we lived in first of all, in a tent up by the village dump. But then my mother managed to buy an old 3-room shack for the 6 of us in the village. Outdoor toilet, coal oil lamps, wood stove for heat. We were poor, but nobody cared. Everybody was poor in those days. But what really struck home was the fact that when we would come home from school, my mother would be waiting on the porch, and the kids would yell at her, "Go back where you came from, you dirty squaw." Horrible, horrible stuff. And also, we would have to fight. And but another lesson in those years was that eventually people got to know us as individuals, and that's what I was saying. That if they look upon you as a stereotype, you're just invisible. But if they get to know you, they see who you are, for better or worse, and you become, understanding is built, and you become friends. In those years also, I learned to read at an early age. I haunted the village library, began to do well in school. Then I had a really lucky break. I was working on the estate of a multi-millionaire from the United States, the founder, the president of Pittsburgh Paint and Plate Glass. And he called me up one day when I was in grade 12. There were 4 of us in grade 12. And he said, understood I was still in school, and would I like to carry on, do grade 13, go to university? And I said, of course. And so every year for the next 5 years, I received a check from his accountant. So I immediately moved to London, Ontario, rented an apartment, and went to Central Collegiate. Greatest group of snobs I ever met in my life. no one would say hello to me. I was from this little town up in the north. Hardly wait to get out of there, but they were great teachers. Then I went to Western, taught for a while, joined the Foreign Service, and rose to be a deputy minister. And a great deal of that was based on the fact that I had learned to read at an early age, and so I was very, very convinced that reading and education was the ticket out of a life of poverty. And even more important, it was a means of understanding other cultures. And this is a major part of the job of an ambassador. And I served in about 12 different countries. And so that's why I became involved so heavily in helping Native kids when I was Lieutenant Governor. I saw that the kids were, after my trips up there, and I saw the suicides, I saw that the kids were in such pain. I thought, maybe I'll help them by, they had no books in their libraries, they had no sports equipment, no special education teachers. They were at least 5 years behind other kids in terms of their educational levels. And so I launched a number of initiatives. I won't go into them, but with the help of people of goodwill in the province, I collected and put into Native communities across Ontario, Northern Quebec, and Nunavut 1.5 million books. And those books are still up there. They're still the only libraries they have. I set up a book club for 5,000 kids. These kids continue to receive a brand new book every 3 months. I raised the money from private sources. I set up summer reading camps. I raised about $7 million for that. Asked Frontier College to implement it. Last summer they did about 40 camps in Ontario and elsewhere. My money is run out, but they're collecting it still. I set up a club. I set up or had literary prizes established for Native kids. But one of the things I learned was that one person, no matter what he does, can't replace the government. It's the government's responsibility to provide them with the same levels of education, the same types of schools, same special education teachers as any other Canadian, and they're not doing it. And so, even though the kids line up to borrow books, even though the kids that go to the camps I established do better in the fall when they go back to school, they continue to die. So it's about 25 a year continue to die. And this literary prize I set up, creative writing prizes. We give out 6 prizes to Native kids across the province. And they submit short stories and poems. Tremendously popular. But the kids, their stories are stories, and not just the kids from the Native kids from the north, but Native kids pretty well anywhere, because they're looked down upon more than Native kids from any other ethnicity. The kids in the north, kids everywhere, are very sad. 2 weeks ago, I handed out 6 prizes to the winners of this year's program, and this particular poem is from a little girl, 12 years of age, from Wanneman Lake First Nation. And that's what I was telling you about, Wanneman Lake, where the 3 kids hanged themselves. That's 6 or 7 years ago. Here's a little girl writing about, and I'll just read this poem, by Chelsea Mackay, age 12, Wanneman Lake. It's called Trapped. There's not a light. There's no sound. I need help. There's a place and time to be saved, but is it now? I need help. Help me now. I'm stuck in this place. I feel alone. I want to go somewhere else. It's so dark. It's so cold. Can you help me now? I'll be waiting here for you. I feel sad. I think I'm going insane. Can you help me now? I feel sick. I feel lonely. I need help right now. I've been yelling for help every day. Can you hear me now? This is not kidding around. This is a girl who is in her last straits of isolation, marginalization, rejection, and feeling so sad that she doesn't belong and is not accepted in Canadian society and is overwhelmed by the problems of her reserve. And so what I have been doing since I retired as Lieutenant Governor is I have been trying to, since I no longer can raise money and I don't sit beside wealthy people anymore, my camps and other things are doing well. They don't need me. So I've turned to writing. I've written 4 nonfiction books and I've written 2 novels. My first novel, which I'm not going to have time to read from, but it's called As Long as the Rivers Flow, deals with the whole issue of residential schools from the point of view of a Native girl from the age of 3 to the age of 45, tracing her life, what her life was like before she went to the reserve, went to residential school, what it was like in the residential school, and afterwards, and how her life was destroyed by the residential school. But that ends with a note of hope at the end. And so that's called As Long as the Rivers Flow. It is now in its 3rd printing. It has been adopted by the school boards of the Northwest Territory, Trillium School Board, by a number of university English literature courses. And I'm very happy that people who read it are able to see and understand the trauma of the residential school system from the point of view of a woman who went through. Because in fact, everything in the book is true. That woman is a composite of 3 women who went to the St. Anne's residential school on James Bay and who were raped repeatedly over years by a priest. And what happened to them. And so I thought that it was important to get that out. Then the book that I just finished writing, which will be out in next spring, is called The Redemption of Oscar Wolf. And there I look upon the life of a Native boy who commits a horrendous crime out of a misjudged sense of injustice against the white people of his village, in which, as a result, the village burns down, his grandfather dies, and he has to spend his life atoning for that. But as I go through the book, and as in Raising Wine as well, I don't say that Native kids, Native people are all the good people, and the white people are the bad people. I try to look upon, and this is what the difference between, let's say, literature for escape and entertainment, and literature, novels, literary novels. You examine very much and follow the interior life of all the characters, whether they're on the side of the angels or on the side of the devil, and see that in every one of them there's good and there's bad. And what they do, and as people read them, I hope they're able to understand the other, and to understand that you have to walk in the shoes of the other. Whether you're a Scottish Canadian and all of a sudden there are Muslim Canadians who have come to your town and you don't really like them, you don't understand them, you know you have to walk in their shoes for a while to understand them. Or vice versa. But particular, since I'm talking about Native people, I hope that non-Native people will be able to walk in the shoes of Native people when they read novels like this. So thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, miigwech, to James Bartleman for being here, and thank you to our audience for your kind attention today. And I know that you'll also be interested to know that our next guest, Katrina Onstad, is here next week, same time, same place, Thursday, 2 o'clock at D1060. She's a journalist out of Toronto. I do want to add, though, that I am very touched, and I know that you are also moved by these stories and that I hope that you carry with you what you heard today, because this is very important to all of us. And I want to commend those who are taking now and also teaching in and working hard to promote the new First Nation Studies major in our General Arts and Science program. So I want to thank Mr. Bartleman very much for being here.
Thank you.